I've got another podcasting first for you today. Something so terrifying was discussed that I pretty much had no choice but to edit it out. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, Senior Editor for Creative Screenwriting Magazine. I'm very pleased to have screenwriter Matthew Michael Carnahan with us to discuss his first produced film, The Kingdom. And, I asked Carnahan a question that you'll hear me ask, and, his answer might give some bad people out there good ideas, so I knew the minute he started answering it that I was going to have to cut it out completely. It's funny, by the time I got home that night, I received about 5 emails from people telling me how much fun they had at the screening and Q&A, but also asking me to politely edit out Carnahan's answer to that one question, to which I replied, already on it. I then got a few more emails the next morning, so that's right, Al-Qaeda listeners in iTunes, you're out of luck. This podcast has been edited. On a different note, give the sound a second chance in this episode. It came out fine, but for the first few minutes it's a little shady until we switched microphones, and once we do, it comes out just fine. Speaking of shady sound, while a lot of folks have written in with stellar reviews of the Luc Besson Angel A podcast, some people have suggested that the sound is a bit clearer when wearing headphones for those first 40 minutes until that wild incident occurred, which suddenly makes the sound a whole lot better. And I couldn't agree more, so if you're planning on listening to that episode anytime soon, try tuning in while wearing headphones. And by the way, today's Creative Screenwriting Podcast is sponsored by the all-new Movie Magic Screenwriter 6. Movie Magic Screenwriter is professional screenwriting software used by top Hollywood screenwriters and TV writers. Stop by screenplay.com to test drive the new Movie Magic Screenwriter 6, and while you're there, read some free screenwriting articles and interviews with some of the most successful screenwriters working today. The all-new Movie Magic Screenwriter 6 is available at screenplay.com. And after you visit screenplay.com, don't forget about our 6th annual Screenwriting Expo on the weekend of October 27th, 2007. This amazing event features classes and guest speakers ranging from Scott Frank and Steve Zalian to writing teams like Kurtzman and Orsi and Rossio and Elliott, along with screenwriting contests and more. Don't forget to check out our Expo catalog as a free PDF, which you could download at www.screenwritingexpo.com. And remember to use the coupon code CSPodcast to save yourself 10% off of a regular pass. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our sold-out screening of The Kingdom right after I introduce screenwriter Matthew Michael Carnahan to the crowd. Breaking in stories. That's what we always start with. As I sit down here, to my knowledge, you went to USC for poli-sci and for international relations. Talk about getting out of SC and then going, I believe, to Washington, D.C. to work in a think tank.
Yeah. Well, first, can everybody hear me? I went from SC. I go to the greatest film school in the country and don't go to the film program. I left. My first job out of college was a Irish Republican Army terrorism case in San Francisco, where I worked for the legal defense team for this guy Kevin Art, who had he did something small like murder a prison warden and escaped to the United States and was selling cars in San Diego, I believe, living on a boat, and the FBI grabbed him after 9 years and extradited him to San Francisco, where the other 2 guys he escaped with were caught. And that kind of, that obviously sparked a lot of my interest in things you see up here. And that job led to a job at a think tank in Washington, D.C., where, despite the fact that I'm about to swallow my tongue, I'm so nervous, I was a public speaker for this crew, this healthcare think tank in Washington, D.C. And there's another long-winded, varied story as to how I went from there to this.
Well, that's what we're going to get into, actually.
Fantastic, I imagine.
I'm going to switch mics with you because I think
Please. Okay.
I want everyone to hear you.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Hey, all right. Welcome.
You don't have to go that loud. But, all right, well, so you were on, it was called the advisory board, right? Was that
Yes.
the think tank? Okay.
Yeah.
That was the think tank. So your brother Joe, of course, is...
Who's right back there.
Oh, really? Cool.
Yeah.
Right on. Love your work. Your brother Joe, of course, had to play an influence, I would assume, at some point. A lot of people know him as the director of Narc.
Yeah. Tell
me when you guys maybe had a discussion about giving up kind of the politics and maybe making political films, as you've done.
Yeah. Not to completely depress the mood, but September 11th was kind of my touchstone. With this job at the advisory board, I was in 4 cities in 5 days, kind of travel, and I did it for about 5 years. And I had flown every one of those routes that had been jumped on September 11th. And on September 10th, I flew from Dulles to Los Angeles. It was a circuitous route. I went through DFW, but you wake up the next morning and you realize you were in that very airspace, not 24 hours prior. And just by the the grace of God, Riverside County Hospital wanted their presentation on the 11th and not the 12th. You never know what would happen if that had been the case. So I think it was the test screening of Narc that night as well. So when people started realizing the kind of the import of what was going on and the seriousness, everything shut down. So my brother and I jumped in a rental car, and we're driving to Northern California where our family lives, my mom and dad. And in the car ride, my brother said, at that time people had heard that Narc was going to be something to be reckoned with.
And it definitely is, by the way.
Thank you. And he said, I think I can kind of kick the door open for you. There's going to be a lot of people that want to be in business with me, and I can kind of strong-arm you into a writing position.
Are you insinuating that there's nepotism in Hollywood?
Heaven forbid. Heaven forbid. I wasn't born with wealthy parents. I had a great big brother, though. It's and 6 months, almost to the day later, Ted Field was paying me to write Soldier Field. Essentially paid me to buy Final Draft to learn how to write a script. And Joe, in the meeting said, if it's Drek, I'll rewrite it for free. So that's not a bad ace to have in the hole. And Peter Berg read Soldier Field and said there's a guy named Michael Mann that you may have heard of that is going to produce this idea for a story I want to do about a murder investigation in the Middle East. And from that kind of seed, from that conversation, that was the genesis of the kingdom.
I want to go back for a second. Pitch us Soldier Field, because it really is, and I mean this, it's one thing to have an in and get through the door, but once you're through the door, if you do not prove your talent, you're out of there. And from everything, I have not read it, but from everything I've heard from people that have, Soldier's Field was a really solid, good first script.
Well, that's not quite true about the talent, because Joe wrote The Kingdom. So he's just, I'm kidding. Soldier Field and I was living in Chicago at the time, and in Chicago, this is 4 years ago, one of the big stories was how the Italian mob had all this prime real estate downtown, and it's a true story, the value of their homes downtown were getting so through the roof. This is obviously before the housing slump. The prices of their real estate were going so high that it was more advantageous for them, more profitable for them to sell their downtown Chicago homes that they'd had for generations and move out to the suburbs than it was for them to continue to be organized criminals in downtown Chicago. So with that exodus comes this influx of primarily Eastern European organized crime. And the story Soldier Field was about a police officer who had kind of flirted and done some work with the Italian mob and was now caught in that flux as they started to wane and the Eastern European mafia families started to move in.
What did you learn during the writing of that screenplay? What was kind of the thing that you weren't expecting that you rose to the challenge on, and what was the toughest challenge?
Just the thing I wasn't expecting, and this is going to sound like the most cliched, cheesy answer, but it's absolutely true, was just how much I adored writing. I had always done it. It was never anything I thought you could make money at. Heaven forbid, support a family. And Joe never, we were pretty. I don't know if destitute's the right word, but piss poor is probably a better describer. When we were growing up, and I took from that. I mean, when we moved from Michigan, it wasn't necessarily a willing move. It was there's state aid, there's welfare on one hand, and then there's this rumor that Northern California is where all the jobs are. So, Grapes of Wrath style, we quite literally overpacked a moving truck and hit I-80. And when I-80 ended, we stopped. And that's Fairfield, California. And I took from that, it doesn't matter what you do. Hell, it doesn't matter if you hate what you do. The watchword was to make enough money to get to a point where no bank could, pull your house away from you, or you could support a family comfortably, damn your own feelings and, your self-worth. Joe was never encumbered by that, and I think he took from that how much worse could it be? So why not do something you love? So when I started writing, and Joe was always, again, I've said this before, that he's always had a little more confidence in me than I've had in myself at these really crucial points, and he was always pushing me to write, and when I started doing it full time, I completely underestimated how much I was going to love doing that. And kind of love the drudgery of it even.
The second part of the question was toughest challenge.
Yeah.
So what was the toughest thing on that screenplay?
Notes. When people come in and try and tell me to change things. Yeah. So it's my first script, and I was bound and determined to act like I knew exactly everything that needed to happen. So yeah, the whole notes process was a bit of a rude awakening.
What'd you learn from it?
That, heaven forbid, people might have better ideas than you. The real art, really, it's kind of the secondary part of, in my mind, of the art of writing, is the art of being able to separate the wheat from the chaff when people come back with notes. And on The Kingdom, Peter and I smashed heads over and over and over again. And it's only by the grace of God that he didn't fire me out of the airlock multiple times. And I look at what the movie is now, and these things that I tried to stick to, with my fingernails that aren't in there, thank God. It's like the beating scene when they're hitting Hatham with the riding crop right after the attacks. I had done a lot of research, I hope it was obvious, on Saudi Arabia and law enforcement and their idea of law enforcement and how that contrasts. And they do a thing called cross-hanging in some instances, and you're hung horizontally with your arm on one post and your one arm on one post and one leg on the other, and essentially you hang there until the shoulder dislocates. And that's what I had them doing to Hatham. And I think people would have walked out in droves had you just seen this horrific attack. And then you got to this guy who would have been buck naked, cross-hung, being beaten until his shoulder separates. So there are those things. And it was for me, it was all about the veracity of it, and that this had happened and does happen in some instances over there, and some of that stuff is as true as it might be, can be so off-putting that you don't get the message across that you originally intended, that you originally set out about putting on paper and putting on film. So that was certainly and continues to be kind of the hardest part, trying to figure out which notes are good and kind of tamping down the voice that's saying you're selling out and you're not being true to the material, and that's a challenge.
Just before we fully move into The Kingdom, what is the status of Soldier Field? Because I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
And
What's going on?
I was hoping you could tell me. I think it's in development hell. My brother and I were just talking about it over dinner. That it Radar Pictures, and God bless them, they gave me my first kind of opportunity, and I think, without being too hard on them, I think they got the first draft of this script, and I think they were so surprised that this little brother of someone turned in something that actually was, you could read, that, sentences ended in periods and question marks when it was a question. I think they were kind of blown away, and I just think they took it out way too early and kind of overpromised as to what it would be. And we rewrote it and obviously did all the revisions that are part and parcel with that process. But at some point, it was kind of a known quantity, and people didn't want to reread it. But Pete, again, loved it. There were a lot of people out there who loved it, but the stars didn't align. So.
Actually, sorry, one more question here,
Please.
because that I've heard that happen to a lot of writers. They have a script that they like, other people like, it goes out for sale, it isn't bought on the first round of going out.
Yeah.
And it's strange that everyone considers it dead after that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're
Yeah.
saying you couldn't get away from that cloud that was hanging over it, even though after there was maybe a rewrite or more development?
I got, again, not to sound like a conceited prick, but I got 2 jobs fairly quickly after that. The Kingdom, and then another script for MGM that was called TV, about live sports television. And so I really didn't have the time or frankly the energy at some point to keep poring over that. I felt like it did for me more than I could have ever hoped. It got me another job, and being a poor Irishman, you're always convinced this day of work is your very last. So yeah, I think it was just a matter of, okay, I'm comfortable with how much of myself I threw into that, and now it's time to move on. And if the powers that be that bought that from me and commissioned me to write that do what they need to do, then so be it.
To my knowledge, The Kingdom started when Peter Berg in 1996 had an idea based off the Khobar Towers attack, which I believe killed 19 Americans.
Airmen, yeah.
Yeah, wounded 372, and it was Saudi Hezbollah that was involved with this. And he had an idea ruminating for a long time. Talk about how they brought you in for this, and then how you went from there. I'm not sure how Michael Mann became involved, so you could fill that in.
Yeah, well, Michael just took an interest in Pete, kind of this fatherly interest in Pete. He saw a pilot that Pete shot about a mental institution, which I'm sure is from firsthand experience on his part. Don't quote me on that. And
don't worry, this is only going into iTunes.
Oh, great. And he loved it, so he just quite literally said, I think you've got talent, and if you have any ideas, I'd love it if I was the first one you bounce them off of. And this idea that Pete had, and he had met this Saudi billionaire heir in Monaco, of all places, because I'm sure that's where you meet plenty of Saudi billionaire heirs, and just a wonderful, wonderful guy. Kind of completely blew all the stereotypes out of the water for me. And the more he told us about the country and how things work, and the more he kind of verified all these ideas that we had, the more excited we got about the project. So it was certainly Khobar, I think, that sent Pete down this path, and and then meeting this Saudi man. He also has a friend that was a sniper in the FBI for their hostage rescue team, who went on security details into Palestine and the occupied territories, and saw just amazing stuff. Both
you
good
mean
and
Israel,
bad.
of course.
Exactly. And he told Pete that there are things there that are stranger than fiction, and you should jump in.
It's a classic setup. It's detectives, but but they're out of their element.
Yes.
So what was it like to break that story? Did you guys break it down into an outline form? How did you do it?
That was, coming out of that meeting, the goal was, let's tell a story that people have seen thousands of times, a kind of a procedural detective story, but let's set it on Mars. Let's set it in a land that's as different from the United States as you could fathom. And again, another kind of glowing arrow pointing towards Saudi Arabia. And then current events kind of influenced us. In May of 2003, those 3 Western housing complexes around Riyadh, in suburban Riyadh, were attacked all in the same night. So it just kind of seemed Saudi Arabia begged to be the setting for this.
What year did you come onto this?
2003.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
Very early summer 2003.
How long did they give you for the assignment? Because obviously it was an assignment. How long did you have to write it?
Yeah, that was, there's, again, I'm sure the details of my entry into this business piss people off who actually had to work to get there. But believe me, there are scars. There are scars from my struggle. When it's Peter Berg and Michael Mann kind of saying to Universal, we really want to do this, and we think we have the writer, and let him go. There was never anyone who said you have X amount of months to finish this. The goal, the overarching goal, was always as much veracity as possible. So research the hell out of it, and only after you feel like you've got a real handle on that country and the relations and the culture and the norms and how they're different, only then, should you start writing a word.
Talk about that for a second. What was your research phase like?
It was just, right up my alley. I loved it. Michael has a woman in D.C. named Elaine Shannon, who was a writer for Time, and just left Time magazine, and she covered the FBI and the Law and Order beats, and she knows quite literally everybody in D.C. that has ever been to Saudi Arabia, every FBI agent that's on the Joint Terror Task Force, and over, I think, a grand total of 3 weeks over about a 3-month span, I met a guy, Jim Rice, who Chris Cooper's character is based on, who is the FBI bomb expert. Dale Watson, who was the head of counterterror on September 11th. The whole rapid deployment team in the D.C. field office, all of whom have been to Saudi Arabia, several of whom went post-Khobar. So that that kind of resource you would pay to tap into.
Did you travel? Did you leave the country for any of it?
No, the trip that we had to Saudi Arabia, when we finally got the embassy to kind of drop demands like we have to sign off on the final version of the script and things like that. When we finally kind of reached some sort of agreement, I think it was 10 days before we were set to leave, one of the American oil workers, I think in Jeddah, was beheaded, and obviously the plug was pulled, and that didn't happen. I think I know Pete snuck into the country on the Saudi billionaire 737 from Frankfurt, and was able to see it firsthand.
Well, go back for a second. 15 of the 19 September 11th hijackers were Saudi Arabian,
Mm-hmm.
but of course this administration let bin Laden's entire family go without a question asked.
Yeah.
We have a very strange relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So
That's true.
was there anything else you want to tell us about the State Department kind of getting in there saying, don't do this, or even Universal executives saying, a movie about Saudi Arabia might not be so commercial?
That I thought for sure a company that was owned by NBC, that was owned by GE, that does billions of dollars of business with the kingdom, with Saudi Arabia, at some point would come down with a pretty stern fist. And I swear to you, it never happened. It never happened in any meeting I attended. It may have happened with Michael and Pete, but I think we were given kind of an extraordinary amount of rope in part because I don't think anybody really ever thought that the movie would actually go forward. Pete gave me the best piece of advice when we first started. He said, it's absolute horseshit that people say, we got a green light. He's like, he's been doing it for 20 some odd years. No one's ever said, I'm green lighting your film. It's like, you just keep pushing it. You keep annoying them. You keep getting them to write checks to the point where it's more expensive for them to stop than it is, quite literally. And that's just what, that's just what he did. And I think that was a big part of why we were kind of left alone. And then once people saw the script and saw kind of how, at least the first draft, how it really was current, to say the least, that's when people started to get excited. And I think they were reticent to give any of the really kind of bad studio notes, like, can we introduce a animatronic bear? We want to. That
would have been awesome, by the way.
Yeah, totally. That guides Fleury through his journey. That none of that happened, and I think there was a real. I think I don't know, but I think that they kind of respected what the movie could be, and they didn't want to fiddle with it too much. And there was never any heavy hand from Universal. There was never any heavy hand from the State Department, only because I don't think they were aware that we were writing it. We went right through the FBI, and obviously the FBI has a very different idea of the world than the State Department, and they couldn't have been more accommodating.
Talk about your process for a second. How was writing the script different than Soldier Field?
Yeah. The process wasn't really different. I mean, the process didn't get different.
Did you outline?
I didn't, and I regret as much, because when I turned in the first draft, Michael and Pete kind of flipped, and the studio was like, wait a minute, this guy Hatham, he detonates himself at the end and kills the entire team. That scene where Hatham is at the airplane, and handing out prayer beads, and it's nice. The Chris Cooper character originally in the script goes to hug him, and when he pats his back, you hear like the hollow reverb of wood, and you realize he's wearing a bomb vest. So that kind of thing. Hatham was in the original script was my kind of proxy for the man on the street, because I truly believe, having done all this, as much research as I have, which certainly isn't voluminous, no amount of guns or bullets or tanks are going to win the war on terror. It's convincing the average Saudi or the average Jordanian or the average Syrian that it's kind of better to live. It's better to try and figure out a way to coexist. It's better to stop going after people because of who and how they worship. And I think that was what I was trying to do with that first draft. So, getting back to the question, my process it didn't really change.
How many hours a day would you say you wrote?
Oh, I really cranked. Because I hadn't had a baby yet. The process changed drastically October 7th, 2006, when Millie Carnahan entered the picture. Because I would wake up, my power band was kind of 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. I could wake up at 6:30 and have a cup of coffee and putz around and then get to it. And those days are irrevocably broken and gone. So yeah, I would work, a good 6 hours probably of writing, and then go do what you do before you have kids, like work out or go to dinner, and then come back and try and just take an hour and look at the stuff I read, and if I wasn't going to do it that night, just kind of plot the things I might change the next day. But the real quick, the outline question, my brother was the one who really kind of got me sold on outlines because I did an outline for White Jazz with him, and just everybody knows what they're getting at that point. You know, there's no curveball to somebody who can then hold up the process, because if they sign off on the outline, assuming you stick to it, you know, there's not going to be any surprises in the script. So I did an outline for White Jazz with my brother, and then I did one for State of Play, and I'll never not do one again.
How long did it take to complete that first draft?
Research total, or just the day I sat down?
The day you sat down after research.
6 months.
6 months.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then once you turned in that first draft, I mean, I'm just in shock. You said you did an outline, because the structure is so tight on this.
Yeah. Well, again, a lot of that is, you know, is that I think if we had done the outline, we probably wouldn't have had the 1.5, 2 year kind of back and forth where we kind of were paring it down and kind of getting it into a better order. So a lot of that's Pete. You know, I think Pete has a almost impeccable sense of what an audience wants and when they want it, just because he's been doing it for so long and he's done it from every angle. So that absolutely helped kind of tighten up the whole structure.
Talk about that process. I mean, working with the director, you know, what was your rewriting process like? And you just said it was 1.5 years. So how many drafts would you say you went through? I mean, after the note of don't have them blow them up at the airplane.
Yeah. You know, before we went out to actors, you know, I did the first, the second, and the polish. And then when we started going out to actors, and when actors were interested, obviously they have their notes. And then, do
you want to talk about that actually?
No.
Any rewrites?
No, I've buried that into dark recesses. You know, just some, and again, everybody's going to remain nameless, but some notes about, like, there was somebody who said, and here's the story about Saudi Arabia and current events, and one person's note was, you know what would be great is if Fleury, in that meeting with the reporter, the Washington Post reporter, if at some point he had sex with her. Just in the past, you know, it's just lingering there. You know, so you get that kind of stuff, and you're like, oh yeah, well, you know, you'll take it under advisement. So yeah, I mean that.
Well, I can't imagine out of the four of them which actor would say that. I'm confused.
No, it's not an actor who actually then signed on to do the role. So yeah, it's not. I promise, it's nobody in the movie.
Good side stuff.
Yeah,
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it. All right, skipping that for a second. What do you do when you battle writer's block? I mean, you're a young writer. This is your third draft. Your third script, I believe, as you just said.
Yeah.
What happens when you can't get through that wall? How do you punch through?
Thankfully, I haven't had a really serious case, but when I can kind of feel it creeping up, I just start at page 1 and reread what you have. And usually, the process of seeing things that you've already written. And how they could be changed, kind of, for me anyway, kind of, you know, jump starts the engine. So far, that's worked. You know, I haven't had to turn to pharmaceuticals or whiskey or anything like that. I'm hoping. I can't wait for that to happen. But you know,
you'll get there, buddy. There's a pacing. There's an urgency to this. All of your scenes are short. Talk about that design. Was that in the writing, or was there stuff that was a little longer that was maybe a part of the editing later?
Yeah, I mean, again, everything was kind of was longer. There's a 150-minute 150-minute version of the movie that I loved. Everybody seemed to really love, but again, how tenable is that? With this, it was very tricky because you have to get them into Saudi Arabia, a process which for FBI agents takes days if they're lucky, and we had to do it overnight. So that kind of demanded brevity and a series of kind of quick punches on Fleury's part, you know, kind of tactical punches to fulfill the strategy of getting in there within 36 hours. And then the investigative beats, if you dwell on those too long, you know, it's just like, okay, it's an ambulance that blew up. Yay, you know, now go find them. You know, economy is the watchword there, because you can't, it has to be interesting, but it can't dwell. So there was definitely, I was cognizant of that while I was writing it, but invariably, the edits even pulled that back further. Like on the plane ride over, that little mini documentary about Saudi Arabia at the beginning.
I was going to ask about
that.
Yeah.
Which is just, I think, a stroke of genius on Pete's part.
So was that something that Pete wrote? You didn't write that?
Pete, that's all Pete. His inspiration, but what
you got applause tonight in the audience.
Yeah, I mean, and it does. I think in most screenings so far, where a lot of those details come from was this great. By not just by my by my estimate, but a lot of people love this beat on the airplane on the ride over when they're playing Scrabble. There was this longer kind of discussion about what this place is and how Jen Garner's character was going to be perceived, and we get into a lot of the history and a lot of the kind of this weird relationship that we have with Saudi Arabia, where out of one side of our mouth we're saying we're desperate to kind of spread democracy to the Middle East, and yet out of the other we're still sending billions to Saudi kings that you can make an argument are the furthest thing from democracy, and all of that was kind of touched on there. You can't have a plane ride when you've worked so hard to get them into Saudi Arabia. You can't have a plane ride that lasts 7 pages, So you have to kind of figure out you're either going to lose it or put it on the front end that Pete did, and I just think the way he did it was brilliant.
Your dialogue was really crackling, but I was surprised, and I was interested too, that one of the coolest monologues in the movie you almost give to a throwaway character.
Richard Jenkins.
Yeah, the Westmoreland speech.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? And I thought it was brilliant.
It's just something that struck me.
Had you heard that story before about officers having to write their own obits?
I hadn't. It's just
You
one
made
of those.
it up.
Yeah, I made it up.
Good stuff.
It's just one of those great little moments that you. Yeah. That's absolute truth. I just thought, what an interesting thing for this guy to be that successful and the FBI director and have a pretty zero-sum, almost nihilistic view of his role, and how liberating it must be for a guy in that position to not worry about being fired. And I tried to kind of come up with a story that illustrated that and kind of explain the origins of that.
Your character of Colonel Al-Ghazi was also really well drawn, and it kind of gave an in into Saudis who aren't terrorists, because it's unfair to judge everybody like that.
The vast majority aren't.
Yeah, of course. Talk about drafting that character, and then his speech in the car, which was another good piece of dialogue.
Well, the speech in the car is Pete's. And I think, believe it or not, that was mostly extemporaneous. That was, the camera's rolling and Pete firing out lines. He's just, to see him is to be tired by proxy. When he's directing. The question again, I'm sorry.
We were just talking about dialogue, so I'm going to move on. You answered it perfectly. A few more questions, then we're going to open it up to the crowd. Talk about writing the action scene. I mean, this movie pounds for the last 30 minutes.
Yeah.
You have the kidnapping and you have the siege to get him back. When you write action like that, is it line by line, word by word, a description of they're firing RPGs at, from 2 different angles, they're putting it in reverse, or is it more nebulous and you leave it to the director?
No, I love. It's one of my, outside of writing dialogue and how much joy I get out of that. Writing scene breaks, especially action-oriented scene breaks, I love. So I try and put as much gory detail into it as I can. And I think that was out of that first draft. And I remember Pete telling me that was the thing that really excited him, because he started to realize that this thing might be able to be both. It might be able to, we can tell this detective story, we can have a really great kind of, pulse-pounding action sequence, and heaven forbid we could have an audience that walks away knowing a little bit more about a country we should know a lot about, and a relationship we should know a lot about.
How many pages would you say that action sequence was?
Gosh, 5 at least. And I think it never really came down. It was one.
So wait, it was 5 pages, but it took about 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's great.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It was, and not a lot of dialogue at all. It's just like, huge blocks of description.
You got into it a second ago, and I say this completely politely because I love the film. I
Sure.
got to ask a few tough questions.
Please.
There's an element to this. I've heard some early critics say, maybe it's like CSI Saudi Arabia, right? It's going to be on CBS next fall.
We're in the works right now.
You should. But so it's like, that's the easy one. But there is an element, and I mean this as polite as possible, because the first function of a film is to entertain.
Yeah.
Okay, unless it's a documentary.
Especially a film that cost $80 million.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you nailed it. Okay.
Yeah.
There's action. There's great pace. There's laughs. You name it. Thankfully, no sexual past to that character that you talked about earlier.
Exactly.
But there's a fantasy element.
Certainly.
Where the end of the movie almost becomes the Lord of the Rings, practically. You know what I mean? Like everything.
No, I don't know what you
mean.
Well,
sorry. Complete fantasy in the sense that everything that we've tried to accomplish in the world lately, in which someone
hasn't ended this way.
Yeah. When someone's kidnapped, they're killed. They're not saved.
Exactly.
We're looking for terrorists. We don't find them. We don't get to shoot it out.
Yeah.
We never find them. They're completely hidden. And it's a fantasy element that the audience tonight was heavily applauding.
Certainly.
But
that's the thing. I was standing back there. It's like, note to self. When you're in a drought, have somebody get stabbed in the head. Good Lord.
That's right. And of course, I mean, we want people brought to justice that are doing these things.
Certainly.
So were there other elements in your script where maybe the Bateman character was killed? Or maybe somebody on the team left with a little more than a Band-Aid as being a problem for them.
Certainly.
So tell us about that.
The Chris Cooper character, for the longest time, in that attack on the Suburbans, that leads to that, the kind of the penultimate attack before we go into Suede, he was blown apart. And I couldn't get my head around, and it's still one of the things that I think it works, but I think it lends itself to an easy criticism. Like, the American team goes in and they come out intact, and I have kind of always had a bit of a problem with that for the exact reason you just said, because that's not what happens. These are vicious fights that take tolls on both sides.
So how did it shape the other way away from that?
How I tried to mitigate that was with that last exchange. That it strikes me that you kill Bin Laden tomorrow, the war's not going to end. It's that old Russian saying. You shouldn't kill the king unless you know who's going to take his place. Because he might be worse, So it's that
Only
idea
someone had advised Congress of that about 4 years ago. Yeah.
Or told the president to read a book.
Absolutely.
If which is that last exchange that they get the guy, they kill this Abu Hamza, but these people have families too. They have people who love them, and they can whisper in a child's ear. Essentially carry it on, that our fight's righteous, and you shouldn't be dissuaded by the fact that I'm dying.
Was it a studio note or any other characters that were going to be hurt or killed, like the bomb at the airplane that were taking that away, or was it?
Yeah,
whose note was that?
I don't. Originally, it was the studio's note, but for a long time, the Chris Cooper character was killed in that attack. So I don't.
Was
know
Bateman
how
always
that
saved?
morphed.
Was Bateman always saved?
Bateman was always saved.
Okay.
Bateman was always pulled out, only because I didn't think you could kill Chris Cooper or the Grant Sykes character, and I described his wounds as surreal and how big they were, and then have Bateman beheaded. But yeah, so I don't quite know how it winnowed its way back in. I'm sure it was a studio note at some point that it was such, and not that they wanted Americans explicitly to live, but they wanted to kind of mitigate the violence, and they were worried about kind of how violent and how dark it was. I mean, in the first draft, Fleury's kid is in the Lombardi Cancer Ward at Georgetown Medical Center. I mean, he's dying. So yeah, I mean. I'm a dark, morose bastard. Don't be fooled by the college boy haircut. I'm Ted Bundy up here. So
is it true that the Flurry character was a minor character in early drafts, and
Flurry? Well, what I was trying to do was approximate how these operations actually work, and the Flurry character, the guy who's the SAC, the special agent in charge, they stay stateside and kind of run the whole operation by computer and by phone, and the rapid deployment team is kind of made up of middle management almost. Very capable middle management. And, once people realized, the Flurry character had both Jamie's lines and Richard Jenkins' lines. And people said, it'd be phenomenal if you could get him into Saudi Arabia. That's a studio note. And I checked with the FBI before I just kind of callously broke from procedure like that. And they said in some instances probably, if the guy had been to Saudi Arabia before, if he was an operator, we wouldn't keep talent like that home if we didn't have to.
2 last questions before we'd open up to the crowd.
Sure.
Michael Mann, one of my favorite filmmakers.
You and me both.
What were some of his notes like? What were some of the things you learned by working with him?
Just the some of the studio notes were you kind of have to bring it down a few notches and mind some of the the 7-syllable words you're using, and Michael he could care less about that kind of stuff. He is all for make it what it is, and if people want it, they do, and if they don't, they don't. This is the guy that did The Insider, which my brother and I were just talking about. That's in our top 5 lists, and I think it's proof of his ethic. It doesn't matter if people go see it, but my God, it's a phenomenal movie that will stand on its own for years, and I think that is kind of what he brought to it, and thank God, because I think more than anybody involved, he was the counterweight to the studio. He was just through his kind of sheer force of personality, could get the studio to kind of bend on some of these notes that you didn't think they would bend on.
We were talking about dialogue a second ago, and you did, through your dialogue, have some horrific things discussed, like the kid that was taping his mom's mouth on with Band-Aids.
Yeah.
That was crazy. They never showed that. That was brilliant to say it rather than show it in that case. But I got to say, the whole movie leading up to that final piece of dialogue I thought was brilliant. When did you know that you wanted to do it, and when did you know that you wanted to cross-cut it between the young terrorist now being born, essentially, and Jamie Foxx justifying their entire mission of going over there?
Yeah, for revenge, which, the Gideon Young character says, and you think it's this pejorative thing, the Danny Houston character. That occurred to me when I was on vacation with my wife. And as I was leaving, they said, we really have to do something about this ending. We can't kill the whole team. And if we don't, Pete said it's kind of my estimation that they're going to pull the plug.
So the original, the whole team died, not just Chris Cooper?
It was this, and people seemed to dig it, and again, it was that Hatham character was the guy up for grabs, and the idea was we lost him. And
I love that concept. But so back to the dialogue.
So I'm literally on my way, flying to Miami with my wife, and stop. I got to go get the laptop, and I hope you don't mind me writing for a few days, after I've been writing for 6 months straight. And it just that to me, that little bit. I worked on for 2 days, and I was just trying to find a balance that I thought everybody could agree on. That I don't want this to be John Wayne. I don't want this to be the United States coming in and saving the day, and deal in no way with the complexity of that, especially on the heels of a pretty big, raucous Hollywood-style action scene that you said doesn't happen.
It's wish fulfillment, and that's okay.
Exactly. It's kind of this vicarious thrill, like, God, if it was only that easy. But, I always wanted to kind of put a capstone on that reminded people maybe the more we kill, the worse the problem gets. Maybe you kill a guy like Abu Hamza and you create 3 or 4 in his image from his own family. So that I felt like that last bit conveyed that as well as I knew how.
Please stop writing screenplays and run for office. Go back to your roots, please, every of you. We're going to open it up to the crowd for questions. Right there, you, sir, in the middle. The question was in regards to using titles to introduce each character. Talk about when that came into the process. Was that in your script or something done directorially?
That was in the script from very early on. That was a great note that Pete had that, let's just, in a really simple white font underneath these people as they speak for the first time, let the audience know exactly who they are. And those titles are exactly the titles that they would have in those meetings and in those offices. That was Pete's note, because there were so many people that had pretty important things to say, but you never saw them again. Let's let people read a name and a title so they'll remember that, and that kind of carries through the rest of the story. That was a real early note from Pete.
Next question, right here, you, sir, in the front row. Question was in regards to the dialogue. Coming back to it again, people still love it, of course. It's a really intense movie. It's really dramatic, but comedy was always sneaking into the dialogue at just the right moment. First up, how did you figure out when the right moment was for that comedy, and was that from a note, or was comedy always infused in your original draft?
There was some, but nothing as funny as what's on screen. Jason Bateman, it's kind of the genius timing of Jason Bateman. That's why it's funny. I mean, a lot of, I had so many people at the premiere a few nights ago pat me on the back, that French Canadian line is hysterical. Only if I wrote it, I mean, I guess that's, there's the give and take of people changing your lines. Heaven forbid they get better. I think so much of those great little moments are Bateman in the moment reacting as though he would react in real life. His character was always kind of written as a smartass, and kind of if there was going to be a vessel for any kind of comedic steam valve, he was going to be it. But his best stuff he came up with in the moment, absolutely.
What about the stuff that you wrote, though, as opposed to the improvs? Was there like a moment or a line that you want to talk about just infusing?
Gosh, honestly, none that I can remember. None that I can remember that are better than what you saw. Yeah, so I'll take credit for it.
Next question. We'll go to a lady right there. You, ma'am, in the second row. Question was, we got into this slightly earlier, but again, once it was cast, do you want to tell us more about your process of the things that needed to change based on either actor notes or just knowing who was in the role?
Sure. Yeah, there was a lot of that. That was kind of the largest set of rewrites. Probably came after each person was cast, and some their notes, but a lot of it just kind of Pete helping clarify exactly what these people needed to be. And they were always, the Sykes character, the Fleury character, the Mays character, the Jen Garner character, and Bateman, Adam Levitt, they were always what they are on screen. It was just a matter of kind of fine-tuning that and trying to get them, to mesh like gears. But yeah, there was a lot of work that went into each character as, each new actor came on board. Like I said, through a combination of their notes, the studio kind of wanting to accentuate things, and Pete really trying to figure out, what each person had to do. And then, so much of it is, Pete on set abbreviating a line or changing, punctuation in a sentence even. And having been an actor, letting actors like Bateman run with some of their stuff. So yeah, it's in a whole amalgam of. People ask me, well, what percentage of your writing is on the screen? And I, 75-80% maybe. And like I said, some of the best stuff I didn't come up with. Some of these great, especially the comedic beats. That's just on set. Those great kind of, 1 in 1,000 moments where. You have someone like Bateman who can give you a line that's better than what you've written because of where they are, how hot it is, what characters are surrounding them. I think that has everything to do with how good the movie seems to be.
A few more questions. Right there, you, sir, in the middle in the 007 shirt. He loved the film. Question was in regards to building the bond between Ferris and Fleury. Was there ever a point after really working to get there and showing a friendship between these people from divergent pasts that you decided maybe not to kill him?
Yeah. Well, he had lived. He lived all the way through the several of the first drafts when Haytham was the one blowing himself up, and I knew that. When I was writing it, I felt like one member of each team had to die. It was too convenient if both teams, the Saudi and the Americans, went unscathed. And so, because I wanted certainly one of the Saudis, Haytham or Al-Ghazi, to live, because you have to have some modicum of hope. I mean, there are Saudis in that country that are desperate to change their country, that are desperate to kind of change their country like most Americans want to change theirs, make it more peaceful, make it more willing to kind of look at some of the things it's done in the past, and heaven forbid, maybe admit a mistake or two and use that as an impetus to change direction. So I always wanted to leave one of those guys to give people hope when they walked out, that there are people like us that value some of the same things from a human standpoint, from a very basic human standpoint. So yeah, that him dying took the place of Haytham dying, and I wanted to make it as effective and as poignant as possible, and having caught the guy and then having, the guy's young son shoot him, and then have to have Fleury shoot a kid who's not much older than his own son. I thought that was kind of the best way, and then having Jen try and save the kid's life. I thought in that room, if you had to, you could end the movie right there. I mean, that could have been, that's the small scale model of just how insane the relationship can be at moments. That, here's a kid that shoots our ally, and yet he's a kid, so we're trying to save him, but we just caught the guy. Isn't that a victory? And that question, I thought if you had to end the movie there, if we weren't going to have that kill them all beat, then I could have been comfortable with that. So that's kind of where his death came from.
A few more questions. Right there, you, sir, in the middle. Question was in regards to the genre you feel most comfortable writing in. This is obviously political based, so is Lions for Lambs. He's not sure what white jazz is. Is that what you feel most comfortable in, or do you want to branch out to other genres?
Absolutely. I'm most comfortable in that realm, only because it's held kind of my abiding interest since I was old enough to read books and kind of make sense of the world as much as I could. So I've written, I think it's 6 scripts, and the only one that's deviated is TV, which was about this kind of a Chet Forty character that was the guy who invented instant replay. Essentially, he was the first sports television director to use instant replay, and then kind of how his life went up and then came crashing down, and it's kind of based loosely on true events. But this genre certainly now is kind of all I can think about, and if that, I imagine, I hope, as the world changes, hopefully sooner than later, other things will start to appeal to me. But it's hard for me to kind of get passionate about other things than right now, anyway, than politics and the war on terror. And White Jazz is about it's an Elroy book, so it's 1958 Los Angeles, a cop who is the furthest thing from a hero you could imagine, and it's a central point of the plot is how Chavez Ravine was very quickly and brutally cleared away and given a new name, Dodger Stadium, and how kind of brutal those moves were. So that it has a police and political element to it.
Isn't it also a follow-up to an extent of LA Confidential for him?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the book he wrote right after, and part of his 4 books, his 4 LA books. So yeah, my mom is desperate for my brother or I to do a romantic comedy, so the family can actually see one of these movies and not be disturbed by them. But she can keep her fingers crossed.
But it's good. You're also writing what you know. You're going back to your poli-sci and IR degree.
Exactly. Just the things that I'm passionate about. I think it just adds to the joy of kind of putting it on the page.
Another question, all the way on the side. I got to go to the side for a second. You, sir, in the blue. Was there ever more thought given to go into the background or the motivations of the terrorist cells, why they were doing it? I mean, it works without it because I think by now people generally know why.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. There was, but again, it's hard to give it any more credence than kind of a simple xenophobia. I mean, it really, like, Wahhabi Islam, is kind of the most vicious strain of a religion, any religion. This kind of anti-Western, fleeing from modernity at all costs. I mean, they've butchered more fellow Muslims than anybody, and massacred people over a small variation on the same God, all about who's the God's real prophet. So I didn't want to, because I feel that in my gut, I didn't want to give it any credence outside of what it is, from my perspective, just kind of a pure xenophobia. That there's a real sense that the last 1,300 years of human progress is punishable by death. When you want to take the entire world back to the 7th century, because that's when Muhammad lived, and that's your kind of ambition, I didn't want to lend any potentially sympathetic element to that, and if that's jingoistic, I'm guilty.
Gotta do a follow up that I forgot to
Please.
ask earlier. There's been some talk that sometimes in a movie you could give bad people bad ideas. There's a very detailed planning of that terrorist action, and it's not invented because it's happened before, as we discussed before. But was there ever anything that kind of you had to draw back from, that somebody was like, maybe that's a bad idea to put on screen?
No, and it's a good question, because I asked the FBI guys about that, and then they proceeded to tell me their ideas of the next attacks, and I'm not going to come up with anything that terrifying. I mean, Jim Rice, the bomb expert, was on a panel after September 11th, and it was the brainstorm panel. Let's figure out where we're vulnerable. Everything's on the table, and he took me through the scenario of.
And this is exactly where I cut the podcast. So, a message to our Al-Qaeda listeners in iTunes around the world. It was a really boring answer, and you wouldn't have been too impressed. So, now, back to our podcast with Mr. Carnahan.
But I've heard, allegedly, screenwriters have been hired by the CIA to brainstorm. Is that true? Do you
I
know
don't
anyone?
know.
Okay.
I don't know.
All right, a few more questions right here. You, sir, in the middle. The question was, Elroy's his favorite writer. He loves white jazz. Are you going to Black Dahlia him, is what he said. Tell us where you are in that project.
We just, 2 days ago, my brother sent off the newest version, because Clooney's going to play Dave Klein, which I think is just perfect. And I tell you, we are as true as we can be to that fevered nightmare of a book. I mean, it's we don't have him, the kind of one of the most recent cuts, and I'm surprised it lasted this long. We no longer have him hacking to death schoolboy Johnny Duhamel with the samurai sword, but he still throws Sandra Lynn Johnson out of the Ambassador Hotel within the first 7 minutes of the movie. So, yeah.
Did you co-write this with Joe?
I did.
You did?
I
Is this the first time you guys co-wrote together?
Yeah. Yep.
What was that experience like?
Oh, it was a blast. I mean, it was just an absolute blast.
No big fights? No big fights?
No, none at all. It was surprisingly. I mean, Joe, he's a phenomenal talent, and again, I think has a real sense of what audiences want and how to take a book like White Jazz that has, fans that, and it's one of my favorites, and how to kind of exhume from that the biggest storylines, Glenda Bledsoe, the Chavez Ravine move, and the J.C. Magdalena, the what was his name? It wasn't Magdalena. Kefestian, Kefestian, the Armenian, exactly. But Eyeball Man, we had to take that out only because, what do you do with Eyeball Man, for God's sake? And the making the moonshine with the dry cleaning chemicals, interesting. So I think Joe had a real good sense of what should stay and what should go, and it was a pleasure. It was a blast.
Will Dudley make it in?
Well, remember Dudley, those hacks that did L.A. Confidential killed him at the end. So we have another character that's going to approximate that. Yeah.
All right. I hope to have you back for Lions for Lambs. You've been very generous with your time.
Thank you.
Give it up again for Matthew Michael Carnahan.
Thank you.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to screenwriter Matthew Michael Carnahan for spending time with us to discuss his new film, The Kingdom. If you dug this episode of the podcast in general, consider tossing a virtual tip into our PayPal virtual tip jar by visiting www.creativescreenwritingmagazine.blogspot.com and look for the PayPal icon. Your tips are appreciated and definitely help out with equipment, hard drives, and all the other stuff we need to keep this podcast running. Of course, feel free to check out my blog, which I even managed to update on the rare occasion that I have time to do so by visiting www.jeffgoldsmith.blogspot.com. You can also always feel free to drop me a line by emailing me at yo.goldsmith@gmail.com, and I'll do my darndest to get back to you as soon as I can. Of course, don't forget to click that subscribe button in iTunes or your podcatching software, because that's how episodes are downloaded automatically every time you click refresh. And if you have a minute, feel free to leave us positive feedback in the iTunes Music Store or at podcastalley.com. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, Senior Editor for Creative Screenwriting Magazine, thanking you again for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.